Leviathan, the whale that hunted giants. 36 centimeters. That is the length of the largest biting teeth ever grown by any animal in the history of life on this planet. Longer than your forearm, permanent, unbreakable. Not a tusk, not a display structure, a killing weapon, designed for one single purpose: to hold a thrashing multi-ton whale in open water. And never let go. The animal that carried these teeth is not in any textbook you have seen. It was hidden inside a slab of desert rock for 12 million years. Until one afternoon in 2008, a scientist crouched down in the heat of the Peruvian desert, brushed sand away with his bare hands, and found something that rewrote the history of the ancient ocean. Tonight, we go back 12 million years, to a warm, dark sea, to a world with no Panama, no polar ice, no silence. A world where two gods shared the same water, and where something was always listening in the dark. This is Leviathan, the whale that hunted giants. Chapter 1. The Last Day in the Desert. If you enjoy our nighttime science journeys, remember to like and subscribe to Earth at Night. We highly encourage our community to discuss the video topics in the comments and react to other comments. It is the most fun when we share our thoughts. Now, let us begin. Before this night is over, you are going to hear something that will stay with you. You are going to hear about a creature that carried the largest biting teeth ever grown by any animal in the history of life on this planet. Teeth longer than your forearm, permanent, unbreakable. Designed for a single purpose that the ocean has never seen equaled before or since. You are going to travel 12 million years into the past and feel the pressure wave of something enormous moving through warm, dark water directly toward you. You are going to meet the animal that competed with a 15-meter shark for the right to call itself the greatest predator the ocean has ever produced. And you are going to watch both of them lose, not to each other, to time. To cold, to a world that changed around them while they were still perfect. Tonight is the story of Livyatan melvillei, named for the sea monster of ancient scripture and for the author who came closest to capturing what it means to face something vast and indifferent in deep water. A whale that did not eat fish, a whale that hunted other whales, and a whale whose existence was hidden inside a slab of desert rock for 12 million years, until one afternoon in November of 2008, when a tired scientist took one last walk across a ridge and crouched down to brush sand, away with his bare hands. That is where we begin. Chapter 1. The Last Day in the Desert. The Ica Desert in southern Peru is one of the driest places on the surface of this earth. Not dry the way a hot summer afternoon feels dry. Dry in a permanent geological sense. Some weather stations in this region have gone years without recording a single drop of rain. The landscape is pale rock and wind-scoured sediment and silence. The sun beats down at temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius through most of the year, and yet this desert was once an ocean floor. The rock here is called the Pisco Formation, a geological record of a shallow, warm sea that covered this part of South America during the Miocene epoch, roughly 5 to 23 million years ago. The creatures that died in that sea drifted to the bottom and were slowly buried, and over millions of years the soft tissue dissolved away and the hard structures became stone. Paleontologists have been excavating the Pisco Formation for over a century. Fossil dolphins, fossil seabirds, the vertebrae of ancient whales, the teeth of sharks with no living relatives. The formation is extraordinarily rich, but nothing in 100 years of work had prepared the scientific world for what was waiting 35 kilometers outside the city of Ica on a pale ridge of compacted sediment in the final hours of an expedition in November of 2008. Klaas Post was a paleontologist with the Natural History Museum in Rotterdam. He had spent several days in the desert as part of a small international team working a section of the Pisco Formation that had shown promise in previous surveys. The The team had found good material, but nothing that demanded they stay longer than planned. Equipment had been packed. The expedition was effectively finished. Post took one last walk. This is something field researchers do, not because they expect to find anything, but because the desert does not give you many chances. He moved alone across a ridge above where the team had been working. The afternoon sun was low and flat. The light came in at an angle that cast every irregularity in the rock surface into sharp relief. He saw a darkness in the pale sediment. A set of shapes, irregular, too complex to be a natural fracture pattern, too dense in their clustering to be random erosion. He stopped walking. He stood there for a moment. Then he went closer. When he crouched down and brushed the surface with his hands, he found bone, dark and heavy and preserved with extraordinary fidelity. He uncovered more, and after an hour of careful work, the scale of what was buried there became impossible to ignore. He called the rest of the team back. What they found beneath that ridge was a skull, 3 meters long, approximately 75% complete. The bone had survived 12 million years of burial in near-perfect condition thanks to the specific chemistry of the Pisco sediment. Fine volcanic ash layers had sealed the carcass within days or weeks of death, cutting off the oxygen that drives decomposition. The result was preservation at a level of detail that left researchers almost unable to speak. But the size and the completeness were not what made this skull impossible. What made it impossible was the teeth, in both jaws, upper and lower. Massive, permanent, functional teeth unlike anything recovered from any member of the sperm whale family tree in the entire history of the science. Every animal in the evolutionary group, that includes sperm whales and their known relatives, followed one of two established patterns. Either they had functional teeth only in the lower jaw, or they were far too small to account for a skull anywhere near 3 meters in length. This skull violated both rules at the same time. The scientific response was careful, close to reluctant. The evolutionary history of whales had been built over generations of careful work by hundreds of researchers. There was no room in that history for something like this. And yet, the teeth were real. They were in the matrix. And they were waiting for the world to catch up with what they meant. The recovery took weeks. Fossil bone exposed to open air for the first time in millions of years is fragile in ways that resist easy description. The organic components have been replaced almost entirely by mineral. The structure survives, but the resilience does not. A fragment that endured 12 million years of geological pressure could shatter from a single wrong vibration. The team worked with chemical hardeners and plaster applied layer by layer. The skull came out in a consolidated block weighing close to 1 metric ton, moved on improvised sleds to waiting vehicles, driven north to Lima, delivered to the Museo de Historia Natural. Then came years of preparation work, tools finer than a fingernail, microscopes, patience measured in millimeters per hour. It took years before the skull was complete enough to be fully studied and compared to every other known cetacean ever recovered. When the paper finally appeared in the journal Nature in 2010, the authors had to give this creature a name equal to what it was. They chose 2 words, Livyatan, from the ancient Hebrew, the Leviathan of the Book of Job, the sea creature that makes the deep boil like a pot, the being that no weapon can pierce and no human courage can face. Melvillei, for Herman Melville, the American author who in 1851 published a novel about a white sperm whale, so powerful and so indifferent to human existence that the men who pursued it were destroyed not by malice, but by simple, overwhelming force. The scientists who chose those 2 names understood what they had in their hands. They had found the animal the myths were reaching toward. And for the rest of this night, we are going to learn exactly what it was. What kind of teeth could hold a thrashing multi-ton animal in open water without cracking? What kind of skull could be used as a battering ram and survive the impact? What kind of voice could reach across hundreds of kilometers of dark water and arrive at its destination with enough energy to cause physical harm? And what kind of world could possibly have been large enough to hold this creature and something even more massive hunting alongside it? Settle in, close your eyes if you would like. We are going back 12 million years, and the water is warm. Chapter 2. The Kill. Close your eyes. It is 12 million years ago. The ocean that covers what will one day become the coast of Peru is warm. Not tropical in the way a shallow reef feels warm. Warm in a deep and sustained way. A planet with no permanent ice caps. Sea levels tens of meters higher than anything alive today has ever known. The water reaches temperatures that modern marine biologists would consider extraordinary for open ocean. It is rich. It is thick with life. You are in it. You are approximately 7 meters long. You are a cetotheriid, a baleen whale, smaller than the great whales of today and far more numerous. You travel in loose groups across the open surface of this ancient sea. You filter krill and small fish through the long plates in your jaw. You breathe. You rest. You follow the upwellings of cold, deep water that bring food to the surface in vast, drifting clouds. You do not have enemies that you know how to fear. Nothing in your evolutionary history has prepared you for what is already behind you. 200 meters below the surface and 800 meters back along your wake. Something has had you mapped for the past 4 minutes. Not visually, not by scent, by sound. Pulses of compressed acoustic energy too low in frequency for your ears to detect have been washing over your body in precise intervals. Each return bounce carries information. The width of your torso, the density of your blubber layer, the rhythm of your surfacing, even the slower rhythm of your heartbeat transmitted through the water column. The creature behind you knows your body better than you know it yourself, and it is accelerating. The speed at which a predator of this mass can move through open water is something that modern marine biology has no direct frame of reference for. Modern sperm whales are not built for speed. They are built for endurance and depth. But Livyatan was not a modern sperm whale. Its body proportions, its fin geometry, the musculature implied by the attachment scars preserved on the fossil skeleton, all of these point to an animal capable of generating substantially more forward thrust than any living physetoroid. Biomechanical researchers who have modeled its locomotion suggest approach speeds during a final strike that would make the impact force genuinely catastrophic for any prey animal in the Miocene ocean. You do not know it is coming. You are at the surface, breathing, alive. 12 million years before the word alive was ever spoken by any creature capable of speaking it. It is pressure. 60 tons of bone and muscle and pressurized biological wax, moving at a speed that open ocean predators are not supposed to be able to reach. The impact arrives from below at an angle specifically calculated to maximize transferred energy and minimize return damage to the attacker. The reinforced rostrum, the fortified sutures of the skull, the multi-ton organ of specialized wax packed behind the upper jaw, absorbing and distributing the collision force across the largest possible surface area. Your ribs do not bend, they crack. The physics of the impact produce a shock wave through your body that travels faster than your nervous system can process. You are not aware of pain in any organized sense. You are aware of displacement, of being moved through the water with a violence that has no reference point in anything your body has ever experienced. Your orientation collapses. Surface and depth become indistinguishable. Biomechanical modeling of impacts between animals of this mass at these estimated speeds suggests the force involved exceeds anything in the modern natural world. Your ability to generate full swimming thrust is now severely compromised. Your body is doing things it was not designed to do. You cannot run. The jaws close. 36-centimeter cones of permanent enamel-covered dentine drive through blubber at a rate that does not slow for any resistance the tissue can offer. Upper and lower teeth do not simply meet, they interlock. The geometry of the occlusion means that every attempt your body makes to pull away from the grip drives the teeth deeper into the wound. The system has no release mechanism that benefits you. The creature does not bite and hold. It bites and rotates. The entire massive body begins to roll in the water. The torque this generates across the connection point between its jaws and your flesh exceeds the structural tolerances of biological tissue by a wide margin. The mechanics are not different in principle from what a modern saltwater crocodile does in a death roll. They are different in scale, in a way that changes the nature of what is happening entirely. A section of tissue, the approximate size of a large car door, separates from your body. The water changes color, not gradually, in the way a fire changes a room, instantly, across a radius that expands faster than you can track it. Blood and whale oil and the microscopic cellular contents of disrupted blubber spread outward in a dense, diffusing cloud. The chemical information carried in that cloud will travel kilometers within the hour. Everything in range that hunts by smell or by the electrochemical detection of cellular disruption in seawater already knows where you are. What happens after this takes time. The creature feeds, not frantically, with the unhurried precision of something that has nothing in this ocean to be afraid of. It tears and consumes with the calm of a predator that has never needed to look over its shoulder. This is important, because something is coming. Out there, in the warm, dark water beyond the spreading oil cloud, something large is already moving. It does not echolocate. It does not announce itself acoustically in any way that can be detected at range. It moves by reading the water chemistry and the faint, low-frequency pressure disturbances that a whale carcass generates simply by being still in moving current. It is a different kind of intelligence, a different kind of patience. It has been here for 50 million years longer than any mammal. It does not need to be fast to be inevitable. It is already close. Paleontologists have spent decades reading the marks that both of these predators left on fossilized whale bones pulled from sediment layers across the Miocene world. What they found in those bones is a story of two completely different ways to end a life. On some specimens, the damage patterns from both predators appear on the same set of bones, different chapters of the same animal final hours recorded in stone. This is not an assumption or an inference drawn from indirect evidence. The bite signatures of these two animals are distinct enough at the microscopic level that researchers can identify them separately on the same specimen. Marks that are deep and punctured and radially fractured around the impact point. The signature of something that drove teeth into bone with overwhelming compressive force. The fracture patterns around these wounds radiate outward from the point of contact in the same geometry you see when extreme compressive force is applied to dense material. Not cut, not scraped, driven through. And marks that are clean, parallel, precisely spaced. The signature of serrated blades, drawn through flesh at high velocity by something that did not need to hold on, something that cut and waited. The same bones, the same dead animal, two different predators, two completely different philosophies of killing. Among the most significant findings in this body of research are the healed wounds, bone that shows the cellular evidence of osteoblast activity, new bone growth over old damage. This means some prey animals survived the initial attack. They lived long enough afterward for the body to begin its own repair. The presence of healed wounds on Miocene cetacean fossils is direct physical proof that both of these predators were hunting living animals, not scavenging, not competing over carcasses found by chance, actively pursuing and striking prey that was still alive and capable of surviving the encounter. And the ocean was large enough for both of them, for now. Before we go deeper into what these animals were and how they worked, there is something worth holding in your mind as you settle into this night. Both of these creatures were real. Not in the way that makes a good nature documentary. Not in the way that scientific curiosity finds satisfying, real in the way that means this ocean actually existed. These animals actually swam in it. The water was actually this warm, and somewhere in the sediment layers of half a dozen countries around the world, the stone memory of what they were is still waiting to be found. We are only at the beginning of knowing them. Sleep carries you forward. Chapter 3. The Teeth That Ended Worlds. 36.2 centimeters. Take a moment with that number. Hold your arm out in front of you, from the inside of your elbow to the tips of your fingers. That is approximately the length of the longest teeth Livyatan melvillei ever grew. Permanent teeth, not replaceable, not part of a rotating system of backup rows. A single irreplaceable set that had to last for the entire lifespan of an animal that may have lived for decades in one of the most physically demanding ecological roles ever occupied by any creature in the history of complex life. This measurement is not the length of a tusk, not a modified incisor used for display or for digging or for navigating ice. This is the length of a functional killing tooth, a cone of dense enamel-covered dentine engineered by 50 million years of evolutionary pressure to solve a single specific problem. How do you hold a 7-meter thrashing animal in open water while you destroy it? No other creature in the history of life on this planet has answered that question with anything close to this. The scientific designation that matters most here is not length. It is the distinction between the largest biting teeth and merely the longest teeth. Several animals in evolutionary history grew longer individual dental structures. Elephant tusks in certain extinct species reached extraordinary lengths. Saber-toothed predators carried elongated canines of impressive dimension. Certain whales grew single spiraling teeth that exceeded anything Livyatan produced. But none of those structures were designed to bite. Elephant tusks are modified incisors. They are used for digging, for social display, for clearing vegetation. They are not functional in the compression bite sense at all. A saber-tooth canine was a specialized stabbing implement used to deliver a precise killing bite to the throat of prey. Exceptional engineering, but not designed for the kind of sustained grip and torsion loading that killing a multi-ton animal in open water requires. Livyatan teeth are something else entirely. They are simultaneously the longest functional biting teeth and the most mechanically sophisticated biting teeth that fossil science has yet identified anywhere in the record of life on Earth. Their size is not the remarkable thing. Their engineering is the remarkable thing, and their size is the evidence of that engineering. When paleontologists first began to study the tooth structure of Livyatan in detail after the preparation of the Pisco skull was complete, they found something that would have been predicted by no one working purely from evolutionary theory. The enamel on these teeth is not uniform, it is layered. The outer surface is dense and hard in the way that tooth enamel is expected to be. But at the microscopic level, the crystal structure of that enamel is organized in interlocking prisms, arranged in a pattern that material scientists recognize from industrial laminated composites. The geometry of those prisms is specifically the geometry that arrests crack propagation. When a force is applied to the surface of one of these teeth, it does not produce a fracture line that runs through the enamel in a straight path. The crack runs into the first crystalline boundary and changes direction. Then, it hits another boundary and changes direction again. The energy of the fracture dissipates across the internal structure rather than running to the surface. In practical terms, this means these teeth were designed to absorb catastrophic impact forces without splitting. Not just capable of it, designed for it. The structure tells you what the animal was doing. Below the enamel is the dentine layer. Where the enamel is hard and fracture-resistant, the dentine is slightly flexible. Not flexible in any way you would notice with your hands. Flexible at the material science level. The composite of a hard outer shell over a resilient inner core is the same basic principle used in modern body armor: hard enough to resist penetration on the surface, flexible enough underneath to absorb and distribute the energy that gets through. The root of each tooth is cylindrical and occupies more than half of the total tooth length, buried deep in the jaw with a socket interface that includes what appears to be a thick periodontal ligament. The periodontal ligament is a connective tissue suspension system. In living animals with complex dentition, it allows the tooth a tiny amount of micro-movement within the socket. This micro-movement is hydraulic shock absorption. When a sudden lateral force is applied to the crown, the ligament allows it to deflect fractionally rather than transferring all of that force directly to the bone of the jaw. Without this system, the jaw itself would shatter under the torsional loads generated by a death roll on a multi-ton prey animal. With it, the loads are distributed and the system survives. The occlusion is the final piece of the engineering. When the upper and lower jaws of Livyatan came together, the teeth did not simply meet end to end. They interlocked. Upper teeth fit into the gaps between lower teeth in a gear-like meshing that meant the surfaces of opposing teeth were in contact through almost the entire range of jaw closure. This contact produced something useful. Every time the jaws closed, the surfaces of opposing teeth polished each other through mechanical abrasion. The angle of that abrasion was specifically the angle that maintained a sharp working edge. The teeth did not dull with use. The act of biting kept them sharp. No modern dentist or materials engineer designed this. Evolution arrived at it through 50 million years of trial and elimination. Every individual whose teeth were shaped slightly less well did not leave as many descendants. Over millions of generations, the population converged on optimal geometry. In 2023 and 25, researchers published findings describing teeth assigned to the Livyatan lineage found in Orange County in California. Earlier finds had already documented material from Beaumaris Bay in Australia and from Pliocene deposits in South Africa. The original skull was found in Peru. Each of these locations was separated from the others by thousands of kilometers of open ocean. This matters for one specific reason. Livyatan was not a regional animal. It was not a local specialization of the Miocene South American coast. It was a global apex predator. Its range appears to have been comparable to the modern sperm whale. Wherever in the Miocene Ocean, the conditions were right for a sufficient prey base and warm enough water to sustain an animal of this metabolic intensity, Livyatan was present. Every ocean, every coast, every warm Miocene sea, and everywhere its teeth were the same geometry, the same enamel structure, the same engineering solution to the same problem. The problem of holding something that does not want to be held and refusing to let go until the question of who wins is no longer a question. The contrast with the other great predator of this same ocean is worth noting here because it tells you something deeper about each animal. Megalodon also had extraordinary teeth, but they were completely different in design philosophy. They were replaceable, produced continuously throughout the animal life in multiple rotating rows. Estimates based on fossilized shed teeth and extrapolation from living shark species suggest Megalodon may have produced somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 individual teeth over the course of a lifetime. The economy of abundance. Never invest so much in any individual tooth that losing it is a problem. Make more. Replace constantly. The teeth of Megalodon were designed to be expendable because the cutting edge they produced was more valuable than the individual tooth that carried it. Livyatan invested everything in a single permanent set. The economy of perfection. Make one set so well that it never needs replacing. Both strategies worked for millions of years in the same ocean. The difference between them was not about which teeth were better. It was about which kind of predator was built around those teeth. One was a factory, the other was a vault. And the vault carried its treasure to the bottom of a Peruvian desert and waited 12 million years for someone to come and find it. Chapter 4. The skull as weapon system. There is a structure at the top of the Livyatan skull that has no equivalent in any living animal. It runs the full length of the rostrum. The snout. From the base of the skull all the way to the tip of the upper jaw. It is a deep concave basin in the bone, wide enough that a person could sit in it, and in life it was not empty. What filled it was the spermaceti organ, a mass of specialized biological material unlike anything else in the animal kingdom. Not solid, not liquid. Something in between and capable of moving between those states depending on temperature. A multi-ton structure that was at the same time the most sophisticated sound-producing and focusing apparatus in the natural world, and potentially one of the most effective biological weapons ever evolved. This is what the skull was built around. Modern sperm whales have a version of this structure, but in Livyatan, the supracranial basin was proportionally far larger, extending further forward, deeper in profile. The architecture of the bone surrounding it tells anatomists that the organ it housed was correspondingly massive, where a modern sperm whale carries this structure primarily above the jaw. Livyatan carried it in a configuration that extended well forward of the eye and covered the entire upper surface of the rostrum. The spermaceti organ is fundamentally a wax and connective tissue complex. At body temperature of approximately 37 degrees Celsius, the wax component is liquid. As the temperature of the tissue drops, the wax solidifies. The organ has its own circulatory regulation system that can selectively cool or warm different regions independently of the animal core body temperature. Why would an animal need a multi-ton wax organ that it can selectively change from liquid to solid? The answer has at least two parts, and they work together in a way that suggests the whole system was shaped by evolutionary pressure coming from two different directions at the same time. The first function is acoustic. Modern sperm whales are among the loudest biological sound producers on Earth. They generate clicks through a structure called the phonic lips at the front of the nasal passage. These clicks travel backward through the spermaceti organ and the surrounding junk tissue. Both the organ and the junk tissue have acoustic properties that focus and shape the outgoing sound beam. The click exits through the front of the head as a highly directional pulse of acoustic energy aimed precisely forward. The returning echo enters through the lower jaw. The jawbone in physeteroids has a hollow channel filled with fat that acts as an acoustic waveguide. It carries the returning signal to the inner ear with minimal loss of information. The result is a biological sonar system of extraordinary precision. Modern sperm whales can echolocate prey in complete darkness at ranges that dwarf anything any other animal is known to achieve. The clicks they produce are among the loudest biological sounds ever measured. Some estimates put peak intensity at over 230 decibels at the source. For reference, human pain threshold in air is approximately 130 decibels. These sounds travel through water, not air, and the comparison is not direct, but the numbers give a sense of the energy involved. And Livyatan had a version of this organ that was substantially larger. Scale matters in acoustics. A larger sound generating and focusing structure produces more powerful signals and processes, returning echoes with greater resolution. Livyatan was not echolocating small squid in deep water the way its distant modern relatives do. It was mapping an open ocean environment in 3 dimensions, tracking prey through kilometers of dark water, building an acoustic picture of everything around it with enough detail to plan an approach at range before the target was anywhere close to visual detection distance. The second function is structural. Imagine the physics of the initial impact strike described in the previous chapter. 60 tons moving at speed, the reinforced rostrum as the contact surface. The force of that impact would travel back through the skull in a compression wave. If the skull were solid bone throughout that wave, would fracture something. The enormous pressures involved in a ramming strike have nowhere safe to go in a rigid structure. The spermaceti organ provides the answer. A multi-ton mass of liquid wax and elastic connective tissue sitting directly above and behind the impact zone functions as a biological hydraulic absorber. The compression wave from the strike passes into this material and is distributed across its entire volume rather than focusing in any single structural point. The wax flows under pressure. The elastic tissue deforms and recovers. The energy dissipates. The skull and the brain inside it are protected. Researchers who have proposed the ramming hypothesis point to a set of structural features that collectively only make sense if the skull was regularly subjected to extreme impact forces from the front. The unusually thick and reinforced sutures between the frontal bones, the dense cortical bone along the rostrum, the geometry of the spermaceti basin itself, which positions the bulk of the shock-absorbing material precisely where impact physics would demand it be. These features are not present in the modern sperm whale to anything like the same degree. They appear to be specific evolutionary developments associated with the macroraptorial hunting strategy. They were built for this. The historical record provides the most vivid real-world evidence for what a sperm whale skull can do when directed at a hard target. In November of 1820, the American whaling vessel Essex was struck twice by a large bull sperm whale in the South Pacific. The ship, a fully rigged vessel displacing 238 tons, was holed below the waterline by the second strike and sank within minutes. The surviving crew spent months adrift at sea in open whaleboats, crossing thousands of kilometers of open Pacific. Most of them died. The few who survived reported that the whale had approached the ship deliberately, not in panic, not in confusion, with apparent intentional force. This incident later provided the direct inspiration for Herman Melville when he wrote Moby Dick, the white whale that could not be stopped. He named the real species after the real animal, because the real animal was already the myth. The whale that sank the Essex was a modern sperm whale, an animal whose skull is shaped for hunting squid at extreme depth, not for combat, not for ramming. The modern sperm whale is an evolutionary descendant of the macroraptorial lineage that produced Livyatan, but it took a different evolutionary path millions of years ago. It reduced its teeth, it deepened its dive. It specialized for soft invertebrate prey and abandoned the weapons its ancestors carried. And even this diminished version of the skull system was sufficient to destroy a ship. The skull of Livyatan was not diminished. It was the full expression of the original design. The basin was larger, the reinforcement was more extensive, the ramming geometry was more deliberately preserved. What the Essex witnessed from a squid hunting animal that happened to feel threatened was a pale shadow of what the Miocene ocean experienced from an animal that used this behavior as its primary predatory tool. There is something in the convergence of these two functions, the acoustic and the structural, that feels less like coincidence and more like design. Although evolution does not design, it selects. An organ large enough to be an effective acoustic array also happens to be large enough to be an effective shock absorber. An organ dense enough to absorb impact forces also happens to be dense enough to focus and amplify sound. The evolutionary pressure that increased the acoustic performance of the organ simultaneously improved its mechanical properties, and vice versa. Both functions got better together. Neither required a separate evolutionary solution. This is what evolutionary biologists call an exaptation, a structure developed for one purpose that turns out to serve another purpose equally well. And in the case of the spermaceti organ, the two purposes reinforced each other across millions of years of selection until the structure that housed them became the defining feature of the most powerful predator the Miocene ocean ever produced. A brain in a box, a sonar dish, a battering ram, all the same organ, all the same skull, all pointing in one direction. Forward, Chapter 5. Sound as a weapon. Water is not like air. Sound moves through it at roughly 1,500 meters per second. more than 4 times the speed of sound in air. This single physical fact reshapes every aspect of what it means to be a large predatory animal in the ocean. It means that what you hear arrives at you almost instantaneously from distances that would take several seconds of acoustic travel in air. It means that the ocean is acoustically smaller than it appears. And, for an animal capable of producing and processing high-intensity sound, it means the battlefield extends in every direction, for distances that make the terrestrial predator experience seem cramped and limited by comparison. Livyatan lived in this acoustic world entirely, not as a background feature of its environment, as its primary sensory landscape. For an echolocating mammal, the ocean is not silent and dark. It is bright with sound, dense with acoustic information arriving from every direction. The spermaceti organ and the associated anatomy of the physetoroid head turned the ocean into a 3-dimensional map that this animal could read with precision that has no equivalent in the modern predatory repertoire. The ocean is not acoustically uniform. It has structure. Layers with different temperatures and different salinities refract sound in predictable ways. The most important of these layers is a channel that oceanographers call the SOFAR channel. SOFAR stands for sound fixing and ranging. It sits at approximately 1,000 meters depth in most ocean basins. It is the depth at which the competing effects of temperature and pressure on sound velocity reach a minimum. Sound that enters this channel is bent back toward it from both above and below. It cannot escape. It travels horizontally without loss of energy across distances that would otherwise be impossible. This is a real and well-documented feature of the ocean. It was identified and studied by military researchers during the middle of the 20th century. The channel extends across entire ocean basins. A sound produced at the right depth in the North Atlantic can in principle be detected in the North Pacific thousands of kilometers away. Livyatan was a deep-diving mammal. Its evolutionary lineage was built around the capacity for sustained deep diving. And as an air-breathing animal, it carried its own oxygen supply. It was not constrained by dissolved oxygen levels the way a fish or shark would be. Diving to depths approaching or exceeding 1,000 meters was likely within the physiological range of this animal, the way it is within the physiological range of modern sperm whales, which means it may have had access to this channel. What would this mean in practical terms? It would mean that the calls and clicks and social vocalizations of Livyatan, already among the most powerful biological sounds in the ocean by any reasonable estimate, given the size and structure of the sound-producing anatomy, could propagate through the SOFAR channel across distances measured in hundreds and potentially thousands of kilometers. Other individuals of the same species producing similar sounds at the same depth across different parts of the same ocean would be audible to each other across entire ocean basins. The Miocene Ocean was not an archipelago of isolated individuals moving through acoustic darkness, if this inference is correct, and it is well reasoned, though it cannot be directly proven from fossil evidence alone. It was a network, a connected acoustic community of apex predators, each aware of the presence and approximate location of others of their kind across the full width of the ocean they shared. This has profound implications for how we think about the social structure of this animal. Modern sperm whales are sophisticated social creatures. They form matriarchal family groups. They communicate with complex coded click sequences called codas that function almost like regional dialects. They maintain long-term social bonds across spans of ocean that would be impossible to navigate without the acoustic channel they exploit. If Livyatan had even a fraction of this social sophistication, and the evidence from the size and structure of its brain case suggests it did, the animal was not merely a physical apex predator. It was a participant in a social world whose full extent we can only begin to imagine. Here is where the science steps deliberately into speculation. But it is speculation that is physically grounded and worth considering carefully. The concentrated acoustic energy that a cetacean of Livyatan probable dimensions could produce is difficult to calculate with precision. But the physics of the spermaceti organ as a focusing system and the estimated muscle mass available for sound production suggest outputs that may have exceeded anything in the modern biological record. At sufficiently high acoustic intensities, delivered in focused pulses, something unusual can happen to water. The rapid pressure cycling from a powerful acoustic wave can cause dissolved gas in the water to briefly form vapor bubbles. These bubbles collapse almost instantly. When they collapse, they generate localized shock waves, and for a fraction of a millisecond temperatures that some estimates place in the thousands of degrees Celsius. The process is called cavitation. It is real. It is well documented in engineering contexts, where it causes serious damage to ship propellers and pump impellers, and biology has already found it independently at a very different scale. The pistol shrimp, a small crustacean, snaps a specialized claw so rapidly that the pressure wave from the snap generates a cavitation bubble. The collapse of that bubble stuns or kills small prey without direct contact. The pistol shrimp weaponized a physical process that engineers spend millions of dollars trying to prevent. Whether Livyatan could produce acoustic pulses intense enough to cause biologically relevant cavitation in a target at range is genuinely unknown. Paleontologists and biophysicists who have considered the question have not reached consensus. The hypothesis is not ruled out by the available evidence, and it is supported by the basic physics of what large, focused sound sources can do in water. But even setting aside the cavitation hypothesis, entirely the acoustic asymmetry between Livyatan and its most significant competitor in the Miocene Ocean was absolute. Sharks do not echolocate. Megalodon did not echolocate. Its primary senses were chemoreception, the ability to detect dissolved chemicals in water at extraordinary dilution, and electroreception through the ampullae of Lorenzini, a network of sensory pores around the snout capable of detecting the faint electrical fields generated by living tissue. Both of these senses are exceptional. Both of them have operational ranges measured in hundreds of meters at best for chemoreception in favorable current conditions, and in meters to tens of meters for electroreception. Livyatan was mapping the ocean for kilometers. The tactical implication of this asymmetry is simple, but its consequences are profound. In any interaction between these two animals, Livyatan knew the shark was there long before the shark knew the whale was there. The whale could choose the terms of any encounter, could approach or avoid, could position itself advantageously, could build an acoustic picture of where the shark was in three-dimensional space before the shark had registered any signal of the whale existence at all. In a competition between two apex predators, sensory range is not a minor advantage. It is close to determinative, and the ocean gave it entirely to the whale. There is one more aspect of the acoustic world that deserves attention before we move forward. Sharks have a sensory vulnerability that is unique among large predators. The ampullae of Lorenzini, the electroreceptive organs in the snout, are exquisitely sensitive. The precision of their detection capability is part of what makes sharks such effective hunters at close range. But that same sensitivity means they can be overwhelmed. Sufficiently intense acoustic pulses directed at an animal with a highly sensitive electroreceptive system can cause what is essentially a sensory overload. Modern research with great white sharks has documented behavioral disruption and temporary disorientation in response to certain acoustic stimuli. Whether a targeted pulse from a Livyatan at close range would have had a measurable physical effect on the electroreceptive system of a Megalodon is not something we can test, but the physics say it is not an unreasonable question to ask. The ocean at 12 million years ago was full of things we can only partially hear now, pressed to stone, waiting for us to find the right questions. Chapter 6. The Other Titan. Everything up to this point in this journey has been about one animal. It is time to give the other one its due. Because Megalodon was not a footnote in Livyatan story. It was not a supporting character in someone else's narrative. It was independently one of the most extraordinary predators in the history of complex life. An animal so completely optimized for what it did that the word perfect is not an exaggeration. If Livyatan was the apex expression of one evolutionary strategy, then Megalodon was the apex expression of a completely different one. And for millions of years in the same warm Miocene ocean, they were equals. Understanding Livyatan fully requires understanding what it shared that ocean with. And understanding Megalodon requires setting aside the simplified version of it that popular culture has constructed and replacing it with the actual animal, which is more impressive than the myth in every way that counts. Start with a misconception that has persisted far too long in popular science coverage. Megalodon was not simply a giant great white shark. This idea spread partly because for most of the 20th century the two species were classified in the same genus, and partly because the teeth of both animals share certain visual similarities: the serrated triangular profile, the enamel shine, the impressive dimensions. But the evolutionary relationship between Megalodon and the modern great white shark is distant. They belong to entirely different family lineages that diverged tens of millions of years ago. Megalodon belongs to the family Otodontidae, a lineage of large-bodied sharks that first appears in the fossil record approximately 100 million years ago. The modern great white belongs to the family Lamnidae, a different evolutionary branch. The resemblance between their teeth is a case of convergent evolution, two separate lineages arriving at a similar structural solution to the same physical problem. How do you make a cutting blade that handles the stresses of killing large prey? They solved it independently. The similarity means nothing about their relationship. Megalodon body size is one of the most contested questions in paleontology, and for good reason. The entire skeleton was cartilaginous. Cartilage does not fossilize the way bone does. It dissolves. In most cases, essentially nothing of a megalodon body survives except the teeth. Occasional fragments of calcified vertebrae, preserved sections of jaw cartilage in exceptional deposits. But no complete skeleton has ever been recovered. Body size estimates are made from tooth dimensions scaled against the tooth-to-body size ratios of living relatives. This method produces ranges rather than single figures. The most commonly cited estimates put adult body length between 15 and 18 meters, with exceptional individuals potentially reaching somewhat beyond that. Mass estimates are proportionally uncertain. Large female adults may have reached 50 to 60 metric tons or more. These are numbers that deserve a moment of quiet attention. 15 to 18 meters, 50 to 60 tons, moving silently. No echolocation, no acoustic announcement of its presence, simply there, beneath you. The teeth are what the fossil record preserved, and the teeth are extraordinary. A fully adult megalodon carried approximately 270 functional teeth in multiple rows. Behind each functional tooth was a series of developing replacement teeth in various stages of growth. When a front tooth was lost or shed, a replacement moved forward to take its place automatically. Estimates based on growth rate calculations in living sharks and the enormous number of shed megalodon teeth recovered from marine sediments around the world suggest this animal may have produced between 20,000 and 40,000 individual teeth across its lifetime. The cutting surface of each tooth was formed by microscopic serrations along both edges, hundreds of tiny points concentrating the bite force at the microspike level rather than distributing it across a smooth surface. When these serrations were drawn through tissue, they did not crush. They cut, cleanly, precisely, with a mechanical efficiency that no crushing bite can match for severing dense material like cartilage and bone at speed. The bite force of Megalodon has been modeled by several research groups. The estimates vary considerably depending on assumptions about body mass and jaw musculature reconstruction. But the consensus range is extraordinarily high, potentially among the highest of any animal in any period of Earth history. applied through serrated cutting edges rather than through a sustained grip. The result was a weapon designed for one specific action. One decisive blow. The hunting strategy that paleontologists have reconstructed from forensic evidence on fossilized whale bones shows an animal of remarkable tactical intelligence. The approach was silent. Megalodon had no acoustic broadcast that would announce its presence at range. It read the water chemistry for the dissolved traces of biological activity: blood, bile, skin mucus. The metabolic byproducts of large animals simply living and moving through the water. It followed these chemical threads upstream toward their source, in the same way a tracking animal follows a scent trail on land. The olfactory lobes of Megalodon were proportionally enormous. Researchers examining the endocranial anatomy of the species have estimated that its sense of smell was among the most highly developed of any shark lineage. The creature was built to find things by what they left behind in the water. Then it waited, or positioned itself, crucially below and behind, countershading, the dark upper surface invisible against the dark water above when seen from above. The pale lower surface invisible against the bright surface light when seen from below. A biological camouflage system specifically designed for approach from the vertical plane. The strike targeted mobility, not instantly lethal tissue. The flippers, the tail flukes, the pectoral fins remove the prey animal ability to swim at speed, and everything else follows on its own timetable. The prey cannot flee, cannot surface efficiently to breathe if it is a mammal, cannot recover to open water if it is already compromised. It slows, it weakens, it stops. Then Megalodon returned. This is the strategy. Forensic evidence has identified consistently across multiple fossilized specimens from multiple locations around the Miocene and Pliocene world. It is not a theory. It is what the bite marks on the bones say happened. The placement of those marks, concentrated on the rear flippers and flukes of prey animals in the majority of examined specimens, is too consistent to be coincidental. This animal knew exactly where to strike. There is a particular kind of patience in this strategy that is worth recognizing as its own form of intelligence. Not the active intelligence of planning and adapting in the moment, not the social intelligence of coordinating with others. A different kind of intelligence, the intelligence of waiting, of trusting the process, of not risking anything that does not need to be risked. Modern great white sharks demonstrate similar behavior in their attacks on large prey. Initial strike, withdrawal, return when the prey is incapacitated. The pattern is deep in the shark evolutionary history. It is not learned by individual animals during their lifetime. It is built into them before birth. Megalodon had refined it over 50 million years. 50 million years of trial and selection and elimination. Every individual that attacked too aggressively and got injured by a thrashing whale was less likely to survive and reproduce. Every individual that struck and withdrew cleanly and waited was more likely to feed successfully and live to pass that tendency forward. Over 50 million years, those tendencies accumulated and compounded until patience was not a learned behavior. It was the animal itself. It was the shark before it was anything else. The metabolic logic behind this patience was also compelling. A cartilaginous fish of Megalodon, probable body size and life history, had a fundamentally different energy economy than an endothermic whale. The heating requirements alone that Livyatan carried as a constant metabolic burden were absent for the shark. Megalodon could go extended periods between major feeding events in ways that an animal burning the calories required to maintain mammalian body temperature simply could not. Patience was not just a strategy. It was a physiological option that Livyatan did not have. This is what Livyatan shared the ocean with. Not a lesser predator, a different kind of predator. One that had been perfect for 50 million years before Livyatan existed, and one that would continue to be perfect for millions of years after Livyatan was gone. The ocean was large enough for both of them, but only just. Chapter 7. Two Philosophies of Killing. There is a question that has run beneath every chapter of this journey so far, and it deserves to be asked directly now. How do two animals of this size, both apex predators, both pursuing the same prey base, both operating in the same ocean, coexist for millions of years without one eliminating the other? The ecological answer involves territory and depth and the physical layering of the ocean. We will explore that in detail in later chapters. But before the ecology, there is something more fundamental to consider. Something that explains why the ecological solution worked as long as it did. These two animals were not in competition the way two individuals of the same species are in competition. They were not variants on the same theme. They were the apex expressions of two philosophies of being alive at the top of a food chain that were so different from each other that they occupied different conceptual spaces, even when they shared the same physical water. One was biology burning bright. The other was biology burning long. Understanding that difference is the key to understanding everything that followed. Livyatan was warm. Not just in body temperature, warm in the biological sense of everything that metabolic intensity implies. An endothermic mammal, a brain that never stopped running, a social structure that required continuous acoustic communication to maintain, a caloric demand that had no off switch, no period of low metabolic drift, no option to reduce function during lean times. The machine ran at full speed or it stopped running entirely. This is what endothermy costs. The brain that makes complex social coordination possible. The intelligence that enables adaptive hunting strategies. The acoustic communication system that gives access to a global sensory network. All of these capabilities have one thing in common. They are expensive. They require a continuous and substantial energy input that cannot be deferred or reduced without consequences. A warm-blooded predator of Livyatan mass needed calories measured in hundreds of kilograms of whale fat per week. Not as an exceptional effort during a successful hunt, as the baseline cost of existing, of staying warm, of maintaining brain function, of keeping the social network active. The hunt was not optional. It was the oxygen of this animal existence. Megalodon was cold. Not in the way that implies primitive or inferior. Cold in the sense of metabolic conservatism. Regionally endothermic by most current estimates. Capable of maintaining elevated tissue temperatures in core metabolic organs to some degree. But fundamentally a shark. And sharks have mastered the art of doing a great deal with very little. The metabolic rate of a large shark relative to its body mass is a fraction of what a mammal requires. A megalodon of comparable mass to Livyatan needed a fraction of the weekly caloric input to maintain basic function. This had profound consequences for how the two animals related to scarcity. When prey was abundant, both predators thrived equally. The ocean was productive enough to support both. But when prey availability declined even temporarily, as it does in any ecosystem through seasonal cycles and longer-term ecological fluctuations, the response of the two animals was completely different. Megalodon could wait. It could reduce activity, drift in warm water, slow its metabolism, tolerate a period of reduced intake without moving into caloric crisis. When prey returned, it would be there. It had the patience of its cold biology. Livyatan could not wait. Its brain alone, gram for gram the most metabolically expensive tissue in biology, demanded continuous fuel. Its social structure, its acoustic activity, its thermoregulation. All of these continued regardless of prey availability. Scarcity for Livyatan was not inconvenient. It was an existential emergency within a time frame measured in days rather than weeks. There is something that goes beyond ecology in this contrast. something that touches on a deeper divide in the history of life. Livyatan represents the strategy of investment. Invest heavily in intelligence, in social coordination, in sensory capability, in acoustic range, in the ability to adapt tactics in real time based on new information. These investments are expensive. They make the animal dependent on continuous high caloric input. But in a rich, stable environment, they produce a predator of extraordinary effectiveness, one that can solve novel problems, that can cooperate, that can exploit its prey base with a precision that a pure instinct-driven predator cannot match. Megalodon represents the strategy of efficiency. Minimize the overhead, reduce the costs. Do not invest in anything that does not directly increase the probability of the next successful feeding event. The result is an animal with a lower ceiling in terms of adaptive flexibility, but a dramatically lower floor in terms of survival requirements. An animal that can persist through lean times that would kill its more cognitively ambitious competitors. An animal whose very simplicity relative to the whale was a form of resilience that no amount of intelligence could replicate. Both strategies are genuinely successful. Both produced apex predators that dominated their ecological niche for millions of years. The question of which strategy is better cannot be answered in the abstract. It can only be answered relative to a specific environment at a specific moment in geological time. In a rich, warm, stable ocean, both animals thrived. In a changing, impoverished, cooling ocean, the calculation shifted. And that shift was coming. The fossil record reveals how differently these two animals left their marks on the world. When Livyatan made a kill, the evidence was enormous. The grab and tear method, the massive tissue displacement, the blood and whale oil dispersing across hundreds of square meters of ocean surface, the chemical plume drifting downwind and downcurrent for kilometers, every predator and scavenger within range drawn toward the coordinates. The attack was an announcement. It told the whole ocean where Livyatan was and what it had done. Megalodon kills were quieter. The cut and withdraw, the contained damage, the prey drifting, weakening, dying on its own timeline while the shark waited at a distance. When Megalodon returned to feed, the carcass was largely intact. The chemical bloom was smaller, more localized. The announcement was measured in comparison. What this means ecologically is extraordinary. Livyatan kills fed the whole ocean. Every whale fall created by the grip and tear approach scattered caloric resources across a wide area, drawing in every kind of opportunist. Seabirds, smaller sharks, bony fish, and potentially including the very megalodons it otherwise competed with. Livyatan may have been inadvertently feeding its own competition, the apex predator as involuntary ecosystem benefactor, too large and too fierce to be challenged directly, but generous in the wreckage it left behind. This is the chapter where we pause at the boundary between the past and the present, because this divide between the investment strategy and the efficiency strategy did not end in the Miocene. It runs through the entire history of life. It runs through every competition between warm-blooded and cold-blooded predators in every ecosystem that has ever existed. It runs through the history of our own lineage. The primates who invested everything in intelligence and social structure at enormous metabolic cost, who needed more food per kilogram than almost any other land mammal, and who found themselves at the apex of every ecosystem they entered. Investment won on land, in the ocean for a few million years. It won there too. The questions we carry into the second half of this journey are about what happened when the investment stopped paying off, when the ocean changed, when the calories became harder to find, when the bill for all that intelligence and warmth and social complexity came due. Rest now, the water is still warm, but not for much longer. Chapter 8. The Ocean That Made Monsters. Before there were monsters, there was a world that made them possible. This is the chapter that answers the question that every previous chapter has quietly carried. How did two animals of this size exist at the same time in the same ocean? The answer is not found in the anatomy of the predators. It is found in the world they lived in. A world so different from the one we inhabit today that it requires a deliberate act of imagination to hold it clearly in the mind. The Miocene epoch, approximately 5 million to 23 million years ago. A planet that shares its name with ours, but very little else. Start with what was missing. There was no permanent Arctic ice cap during the peak warmth of the Middle Miocene. The ice sheets that define the modern poles and anchor the thermal gradient of the entire planet were either absent or dramatically reduced. This single fact cascades through every aspect of the ocean and the atmosphere. Without permanent polar ice, the temperature differential between the equator and the poles was smaller. The thermal engine that drives the modern circulation of the world's oceans ran differently, more slowly, with less violence. And there was no Panama. This is perhaps the single most consequential geological fact of the Miocene. The narrow strip of land that today connects North and South America and separates the Atlantic from the Pacific did not exist. In its place was a wide, deep seaway, an open corridor of ocean connecting two great basins across the equator. Warm equatorial water moved freely east and west through this gap. It did not pile up against a continental barrier and deflect northward the way the modern Gulf Stream does. It circulated. The result was something oceanographers call the circumequatorial current, a planetary belt of warm water moving continuously around the Earth at the equator, carrying heat from the tropics outward, distributing warmth into latitudes that today are cold and seasonally dark. The global mean sea surface temperature during the Miocene climatic optimum was 3 to 5 degrees Celsius warmer than today. Sea levels were tens of meters higher than the modern baseline. Vast, shallow, epicontinental seas flooded areas that are dry land today across South America, North Africa, and parts of Europe. 3 to 5 degrees does not sound like much. But in ocean systems, the difference between 3 and 5 degrees of mean temperature is the difference between one kind of world and an entirely different one. The shallow coastal nursery grounds that warm water creates, the expanded range of warm water prey species, the metabolic conditions for large endothermic predators, maintaining body temperature in deep water, all of these depended on a world that was warmer than the one we know. Walk along the coast of what will one day become Western South America during the Middle Miocene. The continent is recognizable in outline. The Pacific is to the west. The Andes are rising. Not yet the full height of the modern range, but tall enough and oriented correctly enough to do something important to the atmosphere above them. The prevailing trade winds that blow across the Pacific toward the South American coast rise as they hit the Andean terrain. As they rise, they cool. As they cool, they drop their moisture. Rain falls on the windward slopes. On the leeward side, the air descends dry. But the interaction between the Andean slope and the wind does something else at the ocean's surface. The persistent southerly winds blowing along the coast drag the surface layer of the ocean northward and slightly offshore. Surface water moves away from the coast. Something has to replace it. And what replaces it comes from below, from depth. From the cold, dark layer of nutrient-rich water that sits below the sunlit zone in every ocean on Earth. This is upwelling. And along the Miocene coast of South America, it operated at a scale that dwarfs what even the modern Humboldt current produces. The cold, nutrient-dense water coming to the surface carried dissolved nitrogen and phosphorus and silica in concentrations that triggered massive biological responses in the surface layer, year-round, not seasonally. The Andean topography and the trade wind geometry created a nearly continuous upwelling engine along hundreds of kilometers of coastline and extending outward into open ocean beyond the continental shelf. Microscopic algae called diatoms bloomed across thousands of square kilometers of ocean surface. Diatoms are siliceous organisms. They build their cell walls from silica. When they die, they sink. And when they accumulate on the ocean floor over millions of years, they form a specific kind of sedimentary rock. The Pisco Formation is largely composed of diatomite. It is the fossil record of this bloom. Every gram of it is the compressed remains of countless individual algae that lived and died in these upwelling waters. And it is this specific chemistry of accumulation that preserved the skull of Livyatan with the extraordinary fidelity that Klaas Post found in November of 2008. The ocean that made the predator also made the stone that preserved it. Follow the food chain upward from the diatom bloom. Diatoms feed copepods, tiny crustaceans. Copepods feed krill. Krill and small fish feed baleen whales. And in the Miocene, the baleen whales, feeding on this extraordinary upwelling productivity, belonged primarily to a family called the Cetotheriidae. Cetotheriids were not the giants that fill the oceans today: the blue whale, the fin whale, the humpback. These came later through separate evolutionary paths after the Miocene ended. Cetotheriids were smaller, 4 to 10 meters typically, less massive, slower, more numerous, far more numerous than the great whales of today. This is the critical point. Not their size, but their abundance. An ocean overflowing with 4 to 8 meter baleen whales presented a completely different caloric landscape than the modern ocean, with its scattered population of much larger but far less numerous great whales. For a predator targeting medium-sized whales, the Miocene Cetotheriid population was a prey base of extraordinary richness. Not individual bonanzas separated by days of searching, but a continuous, dense resource distributed across vast areas of productive ocean. The thermodynamic argument for why this specific prey base was necessary follows directly from the metabolic costs discussed in the previous chapter. A 50-ton endothermic predator maintaining brain function and social coordination and thermoregulation requires an enormous caloric input on a weekly and daily basis. Modeled estimates for an animal of Livyatan probable mass and metabolic intensity suggest feeding requirements comparable to or exceeding those of the modern sperm whale, which itself must feed almost continuously to maintain body condition across its full lifespan. For a predator of this mass-hunting prey averaging perhaps 5 to 7 meters in body length, the mathematics of survival required not occasional successful hunts, but regular successful hunts across a prey base, dense enough to make that regularity achievable. Only an ocean producing cetotheriids in the numbers and distribution suggested by the Pisco Formation and analogous Miocene deposits around the world could have sustained two apex predators of Livyatan and Megalodon scale. Simultaneously, remove the cetotheriid prey base and neither animal has a viable caloric foundation. The monsters required the ocean that made the monsters. This is not a coincidence. It is the logic of ecology. Every apex predator is a reflection of its prey base. The most reliable way to estimate how abundant a predator was is to estimate how abundant its prey was. The abundance of cetotheriid fossils in Miocene marine deposits worldwide, accumulated across millions of years of productive ocean, tells you something precise about the scale of the world these predators inhabited. It was the most productive shallow ocean system of the Cenozoic, and for a few million years it supported what may have been the most powerful pair of apex predators the world has seen since the end of the age of dinosaurs. The sun was warm, the current was strong, the water was full, and somewhere in the warm dark below the surface of that ancient sea something was always listening. Chapter 9. The Family Tree of Monsters. Livyatan did not appear without warning. It was not a sudden aberration in the fossil record, not a unique evolutionary accident, not the only animal of its kind that ever existed. When paleontologists began examining the broader phylogeny of the Physeteroid family in the years after the 2010 description of Livyatan, they found something that reframed everything. Livyatan was the last and largest member of an entire adaptive radiation of whale-hunting whales, a whole guild of animals that had been evolving and diversifying and growing larger across the Miocene, testing variations on the same core theme. How do you use the basic Physeteroid body plan to hunt animals larger than yourself in open water? The answer took millions of years to fully develop, and Livyatan was the final answer. The lineage that produced Livyatan diverged from the lineage that produced the modern sperm whale deep in the Oligocene and early Miocene. The two paths share a common ancestor, an animal that had teeth in the lower jaw and a developing spermaceti organ and a body plan adapted for catching medium-sized prey in open water. From this common ancestor, the two lineages moved in opposite directions. One lineage reduced its teeth, reduced its emphasis on active hunting of large prey, developed the capacity for extreme deep diving, specialized for soft-bodied invertebrate prey at mesopelagic and bathopelagic depths. This lineage traded the energy-intensive overhead of hunting large active prey for the extreme abundance and complete absence of competition that the deep-sea squid resource represented. It eventually produced the modern sperm whale, Physeter macrocephalus, the largest toothed predator alive today. The other lineage went the opposite direction. It increased its teeth, strengthened the jaw, enlarged the body, developed the ramming architecture, enhanced the acoustic systems, and progressively expanded the size of prey it could target. This lineage produced a whole series of animals that were each larger and more powerful than their predecessors, each one a more complete expression of the core macroraptorial concept, each one getting closer to the final version. Brygmophyseter shigensis is found in Miocene deposits in Japan, dating to approximately 15 million years ago, smaller than Livyatan, approximately 7 meters in body length, but already carrying the signature features: functional teeth in both jaws, a robust jaw architecture, a body plan that suggests active pursuit of large prey. When Japanese researchers first described it in detail in the 1990s, they nicknamed it the killer sperm whale, because the behavioral ecology it implied was exactly that, a sperm whale ancestor that killed things its own size. Zygophyseter varolei comes from Miocene deposits in Italy, approximately 7 million years old, a similar body length to Brygmophyseter but with a more derived dentition. Teeth that show more of the structural features seen in Livyatan, more of the investment in permanent, high-quality biting surfaces. The evolutionary direction is consistent. Each successive species is refining the weapon. Acrophyseter deinodon is perhaps the most significant of all because it was found in the same Pisco formation that preserved Livyatan, the same ancient ocean, the same geological moment in deep time. Smaller than Livyatan, perhaps 5 to 6 meters, but the same lineage, the same design philosophy. The existence of Acrophyseter in the same formation tells us that Livyatan was not alone in its ecological role. There was a guild of macroraptorial physeteroids operating in the Miocene Ocean at different size scales, different species targeting different size ranges of prey. The apex predator role was not occupied by one animal, but by an entire family of animals filling the same niche at graduated body sizes. In 2024, a research team, including Xiong and Beatty and Churchill, published a study in the journal Paleobios that quantified this evolutionary trend in a way that earlier studies had only inferred qualitatively. They measured what is called the temporal fossa index across a range of physeteroid species spanning the full history of the lineage. The temporal fossa is the depression in the skull where the primary jaw-closing muscles attach. The size of this depression is a direct proxy for jaw muscle mass. More jaw muscle means more bite force and more sustained grip strength. The results showed a clear progressive trend across the macroraptorial lineage, from the earliest forms through Brygmophyseter, through Zygophyseter, through Acrophyseter, and reaching maximum expression in Livyatan. The temporal fossa index increased with each successive member of the lineage. The jaw muscle mass was growing, generation by generation, species by species. Across millions of years, evolution was solving the problem iteratively. Each solution was tested by the ocean. The ones that worked left more descendants. The ones that worked better left even more. By the time Livyatan appeared, the lineage had been working on this particular engineering problem for 10 million years. The result was not surprising. It was inevitable. On the other branch of the family tree, the story was running in a different direction. The lineage leading to the modern sperm whale was also expanding and deepening its capabilities across the same period. But its trajectory pointed toward depth, not power, toward endurance, not speed, toward the silent darkness of the bathypelagic zone rather than the productive chaos of the surface and epipelagic ocean. Modern sperm whales can dive to depths exceeding 3,000 meters. They can hold their breath for over 90 minutes. They navigate and hunt in conditions of complete darkness, using echolocation refined over millions of years to target prey that exists in densities that surface-dwelling predators cannot access. The deep-sea giant squid that a sperm whale hunts at 2,000 meters depth is invisible to every other predator on Earth. The sperm whale has the entire deep-sea squid resource essentially to itself. This is why this lineage survived when the other did not. The bathypelagic squid ecosystem does not depend on shallow, warm coastal seas. It does not depend on cetotheriid prey base abundance. It does not depend on the specific oceanographic conditions created by the open Panama Seaway and the Miocene warm period. It exists in the cold, dark, deep ocean that persists across all climate states. When the Miocene world changed, when the warmth faded and the shallow seas contracted, the deep sea remained. One branch of the family had bet everything on the warmth. The other had bet on the cold and the dark. The dark won. What does this tell us about the nature of evolutionary success? The macroraptorial lineage was not a failure. For millions of years, it was the most successful large predator the ocean had ever produced. It outcompeted every alternative strategy in the epipelagic zone. It drove the evolution of its prey species. It shaped the entire ecology of the Miocene surface ocean. By every measure available during the period of its dominance, it was an extraordinary success. But success in evolution is always conditional. It is always success relative to a specific environment at a specific time. The macroraptorial strategy was perfectly adapted to the Miocene world and catastrophically ill adapted to the world that came after it. The same specialization that made it invincible in the warm, productive Miocene ocean made it incapable of surviving the transition to the cooler, less productive Pliocene world. Livyatan was the finest expression of a strategy that the Earth eventually stopped supporting. The tree that bore this fruit grew in a particular season. When the season ended, the fruit fell. But for those millions of years at the peak of the Miocene, it hung there in the warm water of an ancient ocean, perfect, unreachable, the largest teeth in the history of life, the most powerful acoustic array in the history of animal sound, an apex predator so completely itself that nothing in the ocean could challenge it directly. We are still finding its teeth on beaches around the world, still discovering how far it ranged, still working out what it was. And every tooth we find is a small piece of a season we will never see again. Chapter 10. The Rules of Coexistence. There is a principle in ecology called the competitive exclusion principle. It was formalized in the 1930s by a Russian biologist named Georgy Gors, based on laboratory experiments with populations of microorganisms. The principle states that two species competing for exactly the same resource in exactly the same space cannot coexist indefinitely. One will always prove marginally more efficient at acquiring that resource, and over time will reduce the other population to zero. Gore's rule, as it is known, is one of the most robust findings in the history of ecological science. It has been confirmed experimentally across hundreds of species pairs. It has been observed in field studies on every continent. It is close to a law of nature in the ecological sense, and the Miocene ocean appears to have violated it. Two apex predators, both targeting the same prey base, both operating in the same ocean, coexisting for potentially millions of years. The apparent paradox has a resolution, but it requires understanding something fundamental about what an ocean actually is. An ocean is not a flat surface. It is a three-dimensional volume of extraordinary complexity. Different temperatures at different depths, different oxygen concentrations, different light levels, different salinities. These physical parameters create distinct ecological zones as different from each other as different habitats on land. And the critical point for understanding Livyatan and Megalodon coexistence is that each predator was locked out of large portions of that volume by its own physiology. Megalodon faced specific and non-negotiable constraints. The first was temperature. Megalodon was warmth-dependent. Its young required warm, shallow coastal nursery grounds. The growth of juvenile sharks of this body plan was slow, and the early life stages were vulnerable. They needed protected warm water environments with reduced predation pressure and abundant small prey. The fossil record of juvenile megalodon teeth is concentrated in specific coastal deposits that match this profile precisely. The nursery areas identified in Florida, in the Carolinas, in the Canary Islands, in the Miocene coastal deposits of several continents. All of them warm, shallow, and protected. Cold, deep, open ocean was not an option for the young of this species, and a species that cannot raise its young in a given environment is effectively excluded from that environment, regardless of how capable the adults might be within it. The second constraint was respiration. Megalodon was an obligate ram ventilator. To breathe, it had to move. Water had to flow over the gills continuously. Stopping or dramatically slowing forward motion was physiologically dangerous. In cold, deep, oxygen-depleted water, where maintaining speed was energetically costly, the risk profile of operating there was unfavorable. Megalodon hunted most efficiently in the well-oxygenated warm coastal epipelagic zone, where its speed and sensory capabilities gave it maximum advantage. The third constraint was light. The ambush strategy from below depended on the visual contrast created by light penetrating the water column from above. A prey animal silhouetted against a bright surface is the target geometry that countershading evolved to exploit. In deep, dark water, there is no meaningful light. The ambush tactic becomes less effective, and the energetic logic of attempting it changes. Megalodon was a creature of the sunlit, shallow, warm, coastal, and warm temperate ocean. It was perfectly adapted for that zone, and in that zone, nothing challenged it. Livyatan faced different constraints, and they pointed in a different direction. As an air-breathing mammal, Livyatan was not bound by dissolved oxygen levels. It carried its air supply with it. Cold water was an inconvenience that required more metabolic energy to compensate for through thermoregulation, but it was not a physiological barrier the way it was for the obligate ram ventilating shark. Blubber insulation. The same thermal technology that allows modern sperm whales to dive through water that is close to freezing at depth while maintaining core body temperature was almost certainly present and functional in Livyatan. As an echolocating animal, light was irrelevant to hunting. Darkness was not a disadvantage, it was a neutral condition. The acoustic picture built by the returning echoes from a focused click train was as sharp at midnight as at noon, as accurate at 1,000 meters depth as at the surface. And, as an air-breathing mammal, following cetotheriid herds, on open ocean migrations, moving away from coastal areas into the deep open sea. Livyatan had access to the prey at every stage of their migration, including the stages that took them into water that Megalodon had physiological reasons to avoid. The result was a natural partitioning of the ocean between the two predators, not negotiated, not enforced by any kind of behavioral agreement, simply the consequence of two different physiological profiles intersecting with a three-dimensional ocean. The Megalodon zone was the warm, shallow coastal epipelagic, the sunlit productive zone along coastlines and in warm, temperate offshore areas, the places where cetotheriid calving grounds and coastal foraging brought prey into range of an ambush predator operating from below in well-lit water. The Livyatan zone was the open ocean, the deep offshore pelagic, the darker, colder water beyond the continental shelves where echolocation range and thermal tolerance gave the whale every advantage and where Megalodon had physiological reasons to operate with more caution. The zones overlapped significantly in the mid-epipelagic offshore areas of the warm Miocene Ocean. This is where the prey was most abundant. This is where both predators hunted. And this is where the potential for direct encounter was real. But an overlapping zone is not the same as direct competition if the animals within it exploit it at different times. Different depths within the zone, different distances from shore, different thermal layers, different segments of the prey population. The Miocene Ocean was large enough and complex enough to provide sufficient resource partitioning to make coexistence viable. Ecology uses a term for this kind of solution: niche differentiation. Two species that might otherwise competitively exclude each other survive by exploiting slightly different dimensions of the available resource space. Different depths, different prey sizes, different hunting times, different habitat preferences. The differences do not need to be large. They only need to be consistent enough to prevent direct competition from reaching the threshold that triggers exclusion. Modern oceanic ecosystems provide analogies. Sperm whales and deep-diving sharks share the same oceans today without competitive exclusion because their prey preferences and preferred habitat layers are different enough to make their resource use non-overlapping in the bronze, ecologically decisive sense. Orca and tiger sharks share tropical and subtropical oceans without one eliminating the other. Different zones, different depths, different prey, different timescales of hunting. The ocean provides enough dimensional complexity to make these coexistences stable. The Miocene had a larger version of this principle operating at a larger scale with larger animals and a substantially more productive ocean. More prey meant more resource slack. More resource slack meant less intense competition pressure. Less intense competition pressure meant the equilibrium could be maintained even when the ecological zones overlapped. The richness of the Miocene Ocean was itself a buffer against the exclusion that Gore's rule would have otherwise predicted. But rules break down at the edges. There was one location in the Miocene Ocean where the partitioning collapsed, where the Megalodon zone and the Livyatan zone converged on the same coordinates at the same time for the same reason. A dead or dying whale, the chemical and acoustic signal of a whale fall, blood spreading through the water column, whale oil dispersing in the current. The low-frequency pressure waves of a large animal in distress traveling outward through the water for hundreds of kilometers. These signals did not respect zone boundaries. They did not advertise themselves only to one kind of predator. They broadcast to every capable receiver in range, and both of these animals were capable receivers. The whale fall was the one point in the Miocene Ocean where all the rules of niche partitioning temporarily ceased to apply, where two apex predators whose ecological territories had been carefully separated by physics and physiology found themselves converging on the same coordinates. What happened at those moments is the subject of the next chapter. Sleep carries you toward it. Chapter 11. When Titans Collide. A dying whale changes everything. Not slowly, not gradually. In the span of minutes. The moment a large cetacean is mortally injured in the open ocean, a cascade of signals begins propagating outward in every direction, through every available medium. Blood enters the water column at the wound site and is immediately dispersed by current. The chemical information it carries moves downwind and downcurrent in an expanding plume that grows wider and more dilute with every passing hour, but detectable by highly sensitive chemoreception at distances measured in kilometers. Sound travels faster. The low-frequency pressure waves generated by a large animal in distress. Irregular swimming rhythm. The acoustic signature of physiological stress in a mammal. Travel outward through the water column at 1,500 meters per second. They reach receivers tens of kilometers away in seconds. For an animal with the acoustic sensitivity and range of Livyatan, these signals were detectable at distances that may have been extraordinary. And whale oil. When blubber is damaged, it releases oils with specific lipid profiles. These oils rise to the surface and form a slick, visible as a change in surface texture, extending downwind for kilometers in favorable conditions. The slick grows with every hour. It tells every observer, anything that looks at this patch of ocean from above or below, that something large has died here, and that the resources associated with that death are available. Both predators received all of these signals, independently, simultaneously, from different directions and different depths. Both of them were already moving before the carcass had stopped struggling. The thermodynamic logic of a whale fall made confrontation at these events essentially inevitable given enough time. A large cetotheriid carcass represented an extraordinary concentration of caloric resources. Tons of blubber and protein in a single location. For either predator, a successful feeding on a large carcass could sustain caloric requirements for days. For Livyatan, with its enormous metabolic overhead, the pull of this resource was especially intense. Missing a whale fall within detection range was not simply a missed opportunity. It was a meaningful caloric deficit in an energy budget that had no room for persistent deficits. The consequence was that both predators were drawn to whale fall events by pressures that could not be overridden by any instinct for mutual avoidance. The resource was too large, the need was too great. The niche partitioning that maintained equilibrium across the broad expanse of the Miocene Ocean collapsed into a single point. These encounters happened. The only question is what they looked like. What we know about large predator conflict from modern analogues suggests that direct combat was rare. Modern orcas and great white sharks share ocean space that includes whale carcasses. Direct predatory confrontations between adults of both species do occur. But they are not the primary mode of interaction. The primary mode is displacement. One species signals its presence and its willingness to contest the resource. The other evaluates the cost-benefit of engagement and either competes or withdraws. Most of the time, the evaluation leads to withdrawal by the less confident party. Most of the time, no direct contact occurs. The reason direct combat is rare between large predators is simple. The cost of injury in the deep ocean is potentially existential. An injury that a surgeon could treat in a modern context is a slow death sentence in an environment without treatment. An injured apex predator that cannot hunt effectively starves. An injured apex predator that cannot swim efficiently is prey for others. Natural selection removes the individuals that take unnecessary physical risks. Both Livyatan and Megalodon were the products of 50 million years of selection pressure that built risk calculation deeply into their behavioral repertoire. Neither of them would have entered a direct confrontation if an alternative existed. But alternatives sometimes do not exist. Paleontologists and biomechanical researchers have modeled the combat scenario in some detail. The modeling is speculative in the sense that no direct fossil evidence of interspecific combat between these two animals has been identified. But the mechanics of what each animal could do and what each animal vulnerability profile looked like can be reasoned through from the anatomy. Megalodon attacking Livyatan would target the same structures it targeted on baleen whale prey. The flippers, the tail flukes, lateral sweeping cuts drawing the serrated teeth across tissue at high speed, aimed at removing mobility. The strategy that worked on every other large prey animal in the Miocene Ocean would work in principle on a whale of Livyatan body plan. If the shark could land clean strikes and disengage before the whale could respond, the mathematics of attrition might favor the shark over a long engagement. But landing clean strikes on Livyatan was not like landing clean strikes on a cetotheriid. Livyatan knew the shark was there before the shark was close enough to strike. The acoustic picture built through echolocation gave the whale a precise three-dimensional fix on the approaching predator at ranges that made a silent approach impossible. The counter-ambush, turning to face the incoming attack, accelerating toward the strike rather than away from it, using the reinforced skull and the ramming architecture to meet force with force. These options were available to Livyatan in a way they were not available to cetotheriid prey. The physiological asymmetry at the center of this confrontation is the detail that changes the calculation most significantly. Megalodon could not stop moving. Obligate ram ventilation meant that if the forward motion of the shark was arrested, if the ability to maintain water flow over the gills was interrupted, the shark began to suffocate. Not dramatically, not instantly, but within minutes of losing the ability to ram ventilate, a megalodon would begin experiencing hypoxia. Its muscle function would degrade. Its neurological capability would diminish. It would die from oxygen deprivation, not from any wound. Modern orca pods have identified this vulnerability in great white sharks. Documented field observations from South African waters and from the waters around the Farallon Islands off California show orcas grasping great white sharks and holding them inverted, dorsal side down, ventral side up. In this orientation, the shark enters a state researchers call tonic immobility, a neurological response to inversion that produces a kind of whole-body paralysis. In tonic immobility, the shark stops struggling. It stops attempting to swim. Its gills stop receiving adequate water flow. It suffocates. The orcas wait. The process takes minutes. The outcome is total. The same species that cannot be physically overpowered by an orca in direct combat can be killed without further violence simply by being held still. Livyatan was not an orca. It was larger, more powerful, with jaws whose grip strength makes the grip of an orca look modest. The same basic ability to control the movement of a large animal was available to it at a scale that no modern cetacean can approximate. If the biomechanical inference that Livyatan could halt the forward movement of a megalodon is correct, even briefly, the physiological consequence for the shark was severe. The animal that could not afford to stop was facing an animal that could make it stop. None of this tells us who won. Individual encounters between these animals across millions of years of coexistence almost certainly produced outcomes in both directions. The Miocene Ocean was not a place where one kind of animal always won and one kind always lost. It was a complex system with variations in the size and condition and circumstance of every individual involved in every encounter. But the structural asymmetry of the interaction, the acoustic advantage, the ram ventilation vulnerability, the ramming architecture, these factors were consistent across all encounters. They were not the property of individual animals but of the species, and as consistent factors they shaped the statistical distribution of outcomes across millions of encounters over millions of years. The whale heard the shark coming. The shark did not hear the whale. That is the asymmetry that mattered. Not in every encounter, not under every circumstance, but as a structural feature of every interaction between these two species across the full span of their coexistence. The information advantage belonged consistently to the mammal, and in a competition between two animals, each of whom could destroy the other under the right conditions, the difference between knowing and not knowing was the difference that determined who set the terms. The ocean between them was measured in more than distance. It was measured in what each animal could perceive across that distance, and the whale perceived more of it. Chapter 12. Reading the Stone Witnesses. Everything in this journey has rested on a foundation we have not yet examined directly. How do we know any of this? Not in a philosophical sense, in the specific, practical, scientific sense. The animals we have been following through 12 million years of warm Miocene water left no videos, no written accounts. No tracks that persist in stone the way dinosaur footprints do. What they left was bone and teeth locked inside rock. And from bone and teeth alone, from the shape of a fracture, from the depth of a scratch, from the microscopic architecture of a crystal, a small community of researchers has reconstructed a world in detail sufficient to sustain the narrative you have heard tonight. This chapter is about how that reconstruction is made, and why the fossil record in specific places tells us things we could not learn anywhere else on Earth. The Pisco Formation in southern Peru is not simply the place where Livyatan was found. It is one of the most extraordinary fossil deposits in the world. And the reason for its extraordinary quality comes down to a very specific sequence of geological events that happen to coincide in exactly the right combination. During the Miocene, the shallow sea that covered this region was subject to periodic volcanic ash falls from the Andean volcanic arc to the east. These falls were not catastrophic eruptions. They were the kind of modest ash deposition events that occur regularly in volcanically active regions. A thin layer of fine ash settling through the water column over days or weeks after a moderate eruption. But fine ash settling through water has a specific chemical effect. It reduces oxygen levels in the sediment at the seafloor. It creates anaerobic conditions in the immediate burial environment. And in anaerobic conditions, biological decomposition does not proceed normally. The bacteria that drive decomposition require oxygen. In the absence of oxygen, the soft tissue still degrades, but more slowly. And more importantly, in a way that allows mineral replacement to begin before the structural integrity of the hard parts is compromised. An animal that died in this sea and sank to the bottom during or shortly after an ash fall was in a sense sealed, wrapped in a low oxygen chemical environment that slowed the loss of fine anatomical structure, and simultaneously covered in fine-grained sediment of a chemistry that promoted mineralization of bone at cellular resolution. To appreciate how rare this is, consider the baseline. Of all the Livyatan individuals that lived and died across millions of years in the Miocene Ocean, the vast majority left nothing. Their bodies were consumed. Their bones scattered and dissolved. The organic components broke down and re-entered the nutrient cycle. The population was almost certainly large. The number of individuals whose remains survived to the present in any recognizable form is vanishingly small. The skull that Klaas Post found represents not just a remarkable animal, it represents a remarkable accident of geology that happened to catch that animal at the right moment, in the right place, with exactly the right chemistry in the sediment beneath it. The result over millions of years is preservation of a quality that researchers who work with other marine deposits describe with genuine reverence. Not just the gross anatomy. The microstructure, the cellular architecture of the bone, the interface geometry between tooth and socket, the growth layer structure that allows age estimation, all of it preserved in stone with enough fidelity to answer questions about physiology that would normally require a living specimen. The most powerful tool paleontologists bring to the Pisco material is the scanning electron microscope. At nanometer resolution, a scanning electron microscope can distinguish the microscopic signatures of different predators on the same fossilized bone surface. The marks left by different types of teeth in different kinds of attacks are as distinctive as fingerprints at this scale. And because the signatures are consistent across specimens from the same species, they can be used to identify the attacking animal from the wound alone without any other evidence present. Megalodon marks on Miocene whalebone have a specific profile: parallel grooves of consistent spacing, smooth inner surface, straight geometry following the line of the cutting edge as it was drawn through tissue. The serrations visible at high magnification as a regular microstructure along the groove walls. When you find this pattern in the bone, you know what made it. The identification is not an inference, it is a reading. The serrations visible at high magnification. Livyatan marks are completely different. Deep punctures with a circular or ovoid cross-section matching the tooth tip diameter. Compression fractures radiating outward from the impact point in irregular starburst patterns. The marks of something that drove force directly into bone rather than drawing a blade across it. Multiple fracture planes intersecting at the entry point. Bone displaced laterally and sometimes shattered at the margins of the wound rather than cleanly cut. When both types of mark appear on the same specimen, it means both predators interacted with the same individual prey animal at some point during or after its death. The bone remembers both of them. The most significant finding in this forensic record is the healed wounds. Bone that shows evidence of osteoblast activity around old damage. New bone laid down over the margins of an injury. Periosteal tissue reforming across what was once an open wound. These are not marks on a dead animal. These are marks on an animal that was alive when the damage occurred, alive afterward, alive long enough for the body repair process to begin. The injury was real, the survival was real. The healing is the proof of both. Healed megalodon bite wounds on Miocene cetacean fossils have been documented from multiple sites. Animals that were struck, that survived the initial attack, that lived for weeks or months after. The mobility impairment strategy was not always immediately lethal. Sometimes the prey escaped or was abandoned. Sometimes the wound healed. Healed wounds attributed to Livyatan-style attack patterns have also been identified. Deep puncture wounds with compression fracture halos, surrounded by new bone growth, prey animals that survived the grab and tear, that lived to carry the evidence of the encounter forward in their skeleton. These healed wounds are direct physical evidence that both predators were hunting living animals regularly, that the prey population was under persistent predation pressure from both directions simultaneously, that the Miocene Ocean was not merely a place where these things could have happened. It was a place where these things were happening routinely across millions of years. The expanding geographic record adds a final dimension to this evidence base. In 2010, the Pisco skull was the only confirmed Livyatan material in the world. By 2025, researchers had documented Livyatan lineage teeth from Orange County in California, from Beaumaris Bay in Victoria, Australia, from Pliocene deposits along the South African coast, from the original Peruvian site, 4 locations on 3 continents bordering 2 different oceans. Each of these locations was separated from the others by thousands of kilometers of open ocean. Each of them preserved material at a different point in the broad time range of the species' existence. Together, they sketch the outline of a predator with a global range comparable to the modern sperm whale. For every location where we have found Livyatan material, there are dozens of equivalent Miocene deposits around the world where equivalent material may be waiting. Deposits that have not been excavated, sediment that has not been surveyed, stone that holds information about this animal that no living researcher has yet seen. The story of Livyatan is not a closed book. It is an ongoing excavation. Every year the picture grows larger. Every tooth recovered from a beach or a museum drawer or a new field site adds detail to a portrait of an animal that ruled the Miocene Ocean for millions of years and left its traces in the rock of half a dozen continents. Every time a new specimen is prepared and described, it changes something about what we thought we knew, and each change opens new questions that the next specimen will be needed to answer. The stone has more to say. We are still learning to listen to it. Rest now. The next chapter carries us toward the end of this story, and it is a heavy one. Chapter 13. The Long Goodbye. Extinction is rarely an event. It is a process. It unfolds across timescales that dwarf any human frame of reference. The last individual of a species does not know it is the last. The population does not hold a final assembly. The decline happens generation by generation. Successful breeding seasons becoming less frequent. Territory ranges contracting. Individual animals living full lives and dying without the kind of awareness of collective fate that the word extinction implies to a human mind. What ended the reign of the two greatest predators the Miocene ocean had ever produced was not a catastrophe, not an asteroid, not a volcanic winter, not a plague. It was something slower and in its way more inexorable than any of those things. The world simply changed. The process began in a geological structure on the floor of the ocean between North and South America. Not a sudden collapse, a gradual shallowing. Tens of millions of years of tectonic movement had been bringing the two continental plates closer together. Island arcs were forming. Shallow seamounts were rising. The open seaway that had allowed warm equatorial water to circulate freely between the Atlantic and the Pacific was narrowing. By approximately 4 million years ago, the seaway was no longer an open corridor. It was an archipelago, shallow enough that the free exchange of deep ocean water between the two basins had essentially stopped. And by approximately 3 million years ago, the final land connection formed. Panama closed. The consequences cascaded through the global climate system in ways that geologists and oceanographers are still working to fully understand. The warm equatorial current that had been the planetary heat distributor was disrupted. Water that had been flowing westward through the open seaway now piled up against the new barrier and was deflected northward. The Proto-Gulf Stream intensified. Warm water was driven into the North Atlantic in quantities and at temperatures that increased evaporation and moisture export to the Arctic atmosphere. Snow fell on the Arctic that did not melt the following summer. Then it fell again the following year. The ice accumulated. The albedo of the Arctic surface increased as bright white ice replaced dark ocean. More solar energy was reflected back into space. The Arctic cooled further. More ice formed. The feedback accelerated. Global mean temperatures began to fall, not quickly, not in any single dramatic moment, over hundreds of thousands of years, then millions, slowly, inexorably. Sea levels dropped as water was locked into growing polar ice sheets. The shallow epicontinental seas that had spread across low-lying coastal areas retreated. The coastline maps of the world were being redrawn by cold. The warm, extended, shallow seas that had been among the most productive marine environments in the Cenozoic were shrinking back toward the deep ocean. The world that had supported two ocean giants for millions of years was quietly becoming a different world, and neither of its greatest predators had any mechanism to adapt to the new terms. For Megalodon, the consequences arrived through the prey base. As ocean temperatures fell, the geographic range of warm water suitable for Megalodon nursery grounds contracted. The shallow, warm coastal seas that juvenile Megalodon required for their long developmental period retreated toward the equator. Populations of the species that had maintained themselves at temperate latitudes found their reproductive success declining. Young animals that had previously survived in the warm coastal waters of mid-latitude regions were now struggling in water that was too cold too often. The population contracted geographically. The breeding range shrank. The overall numbers declined, not in a collapse, in a long, slow diminishment that played out across hundreds of thousands of years. The last Megalodon individuals probably lived not that long ago in geological terms. Estimates based on the youngest reliably dated Megalodon teeth cluster around 3 to 3.5 million years ago. Although some researchers argue for a somewhat later last appearance date in specific locations, Megalodon did not go quickly. It went like a tide going out. For Livyatan, the process was different in mechanism but equally final in result. The primary blow was the collapse of the cetotheriid prey base. As the ocean cooled, the plankton community that supported the cetotheriid populations changed. The extraordinary productivity of the Miocene upwelling system that had filled the ocean with small baleen whales was a product of specific oceanographic conditions that were disappearing. As those conditions changed, the prey density fell. The cetotheriid family itself went into decline. Most of its lineages went extinct or dwindled in numbers during the Pliocene. For a 50-ton endothermic predator, the caloric consequence of a declining prey base was not simply inconvenience. It was a physiological death sentence operating by degrees. The brain. Gram for gram, the most metabolically expensive tissue in biology, had to be fed continuously, regardless of external circumstances. When prey became harder to find, the whale could not reduce its metabolic demands the way a cold-blooded predator could. It could not enter a low-function state and wait for better conditions. Every hour that the brain was active, it was consuming resources. Every hour of thermoregulation in cooling water was consuming resources. Every acoustic emission maintaining the social network was consuming resources. The resources coming in were declining. The resources going out were fixed by biology and could not be reduced. The gap between them grew with every passing season. As blubber reserves declined, insulation decreased. As insulation decreased, maintaining core body temperature in cooling water required even more metabolic expenditure. As more metabolic expenditure was required for thermoregulation, less remained for reproduction and recovery. The spiral narrowed. Individuals that could no longer maintain body condition stopped reproducing successfully. The calves that were born were smaller, less well-provisioned, less likely to survive their first year. The population declined, generation by generation, season by season, without drama, without a final battle, without any awareness on the part of the animals involved that the trajectory they were on had only one destination. The machine ran until it ran out of fuel, and the fuel had stopped coming. What replaced them tells us something about the direction evolution took when those ecological roles became vacant. The apex predator niche vacated by Livyatan was not immediately refilled in the same form. Evolution does not move quickly enough to instantly produce a replacement animal of that scale and that design. But the lineage that eventually came closest was already developing during the late Miocene and early Pliocene, early members of the genus Orcinus, the ancestors of modern killer whales. Orcas did not match Livyatan in individual body size or individual physical power, but they brought something Livyatan had not fully developed: cooperative group hunting of extreme sophistication. Where Livyatan likely hunted in small family groups or alone relying on individual physical dominance, orcas hunted in coordinated pods using behavioral strategies of a complexity that individual physical power cannot replicate. They communicated attack plans through vocalizations. They maintained roles across multi-hour pursuit sequences. They taught hunting techniques to their young and passed those techniques forward across generations in a form of cultural transmission. They were smaller per individual. They were collectively more effective per calorie invested. And they needed far less food per kilogram of body mass to maintain function. The intelligence strategy had not died with Livyatan. It had been refined, distributed, made cheaper, made more resilient. The orca was not a lesser version of the whale that had come before. It was an evolved solution to the same problem, built for a different world. The great white shark filled a portion of the niche vacated by Megalodon, specializing not on large baleen whales, as Megalodon had, but on pinnipeds. Seals and sea lions abundant in the cold, productive upwelling systems of the new, cooler world, a smaller prey base but a more available one, adapted to the world that existed rather than the world that had ended. The monsters were gone. The ocean was quieter, colder, still full of life, but different. The architecture of the apex had changed, and the Pisco Formation sealed its record and waited for a Dutch scientist with tired feet to walk across it one afternoon in November. Chapter 14. What the Leviathan Means. Before there was science, there was the sea, and before there was anything else about the sea, there was the fear. Every civilization that built boats has a tradition of sea monsters. The Norse had the Kraken, the Greeks had Charybdis and Scylla. The Phoenicians mapped the edges of the known world with warnings and described what waited beyond them as creatures of impossible scale. The ancient Hebrews wrote the Leviathan into the most profound and searching text in the Old Testament. Not as a minor supernatural element, as the defining argument in the book of Job, as the answer God gives to Job's question of why suffering exists in a world with a creator, as if to say, "Look at what I made, a creature that makes the deep boil like a pot, a creature no weapon can pierce, a creature that was there before you and will be there after you. Your suffering is real, but your scale of reference is wrong." For thousands of years, this was understood as metaphor, pure theology. The Leviathan was a literary device, a way of expressing the incomprehensible scale of divine power by reference to a sea creature so vast and terrible that human beings could not face it. The scholars who debated the precise identity of the Leviathan proposed crocodiles, proposed large sea turtles, proposed animals that fit the scale of the known world. None of them thought to look further back in geological time. None of them had the tools to. And then Klaas Post crouched in a desert and found the teeth. The distance between mythology and paleontology collapsed in that moment. Not completely, not in every detail, but in the essential fact that mattered. There was a real animal. It swam in a real ocean. It was enormous. It had teeth longer than your forearm. It was built to dominate everything around it, and for millions of years, it did exactly that. The ancient writers who composed the Leviathan passage did not know about the Miocene. They did not know about Livyatan melvillei. They did not have access to the Pisco Formation or scanning electron microscopes or taphonomic analysis. But they knew the ocean, and they knew that the ocean was home to something beyond the reach of human power or human understanding. They were right. They were describing a memory that was not individual but collective, not remembered consciously, but felt in the ancient part of the human nervous system that evolved near the water and learned to be afraid of what it could not see beneath it. We have been afraid of the ocean for a very long time, and for millions of years before we existed, there was something in it that would have justified every moment of that fear. Herman Melville understood this better than almost anyone who came before or after him. Moby Dick is not really about a whale. It is about the human encounter with something that is indifferent to human ambition. The white whale does not hate Ahab. It does not pursue him. It does not plan his destruction. It simply exists with an amplitude that human beings cannot comprehend and cannot survive attempting to match. Melville wrote that book in 1851. He had heard the story of the Essex, the whaling ship rammed and sunk by a bull sperm whale in 1820. He had spoken with survivors or read their accounts. He had worked on whaling vessels himself. He understood from the inside what it meant to pursue these animals for profit and to discover that they were more than the industry treated them as. He understood that the event involving the Essex had not been malicious on the part of the whale. He understood that this was worse than malice. A force of that magnitude moving through the world with complete indifference to whether human beings were in its path is more frightening than any hatred could be. Hatred can be negotiated with. Indifference cannot. The white whale did not want to destroy Ahab. Ahab simply was not large enough to matter to it. The scientists who named Livyatan melvillei in 2010 were making a statement about that continuity. The real animal and the mythic animal and the literary animal were not three separate things. They were three ways of approaching the same truth: that the ocean contains or contained forces beyond the scale of human reckoning, that the deepest part of human fear of the sea is not irrational, that what waits in the dark water is not nothing. There is a lesson in the extinction of both these animals that is worth sitting with as this night draws toward its end. Neither Livyatan nor Megalodon was a failure. Neither was an evolutionary dead end or a design error. They were both perfectly realized. The most complete expressions of their respective evolutionary strategies that those strategies ever produced. They dominated the most productive ocean system of the Cenozoic for millions of years. No animal challenged either of them directly with any sustained success. They reached the ceiling of what their approach to being alive could achieve, and they died because the world stopped matching what they were. This is the central lesson of every extinction in the fossil record. Specialization is the highest achievement of evolution and its deepest vulnerability. The more perfectly an animal fits its environment, the more completely dependent it becomes on that environment remaining exactly as it is. Livyatan was the most powerful macroraptorial predator that ever lived. But its power was calibrated to a specific ocean at a specific temperature with a specific prey base and a specific level of productivity. Remove any of those parameters and the power becomes a liability. The same metabolic intensity that made it unstoppable in the rich, warm Miocene became the drain that killed it in the cooling, impoverished Pliocene. The animals that survived were not the most powerful. They were the most flexible. The orca, the great white shark, the modern sperm whale. None of them could have defeated Livyatan or Megalodon in direct combat in the Miocene Ocean. They are smaller, less heavily armed, less individually powerful. But they are generalists in the ways that matter for survival across changing conditions, and they are still here. The Ica Desert today is quiet. The sun rises over pale sediment that was once an ocean floor. The wind moves across the surface and carries fine grains of ancient diatomite, compressed biology from millions of years ago, drifting in the 21st century air. Beneath the surface, in deposits that have not yet been excavated, there are almost certainly more bones, more teeth, more fragments of animals that no living human has ever seen. The Pisco Formation extends across hundreds of square kilometers, and its excavation is nowhere near complete. Somewhere in that pale rock, there may be a skull larger than the one in Lima, teeth longer than 36 centimeters. An individual even more extreme than the one we already know about. There may be specimens that answer questions we do not yet know how to ask, that tell us things about the social structure of this animal, its growth rate, its geographic movements, the acoustic signatures it used, the size of the groups it traveled in, its relationship to the prey species it shaped through millions of years of predation pressure, all of it potentially there in the stone. Waiting with the patience that only stone has. A patience measured in millions of years against which any human urgency is invisible. Paleontology moves slowly. The desert does not give up its contents on a schedule that matches human impatience, but it gives, year by year, expedition by expedition, one brush stroke at a time. The portrait grows. And the animal that the ancient writers felt the terror of, that Herman Melville circled without naming, that 12 million years of Miocene ocean knew directly. That animal becomes more real with every grain of desert sand that is moved aside to find what is underneath. The Leviathan was real. Sleep now. The deep water is a long way down, and it is very quiet there.